Yeah. Do we want to talk about how terrible companies are still making money by charging extra for single sign-on?
Or generally speaking, just right, the idea that additional security that doesn't really cost anything more from a company's perspective, they're going to
Right, it's a
charge it more
commodity these
because
days.
right, it's a commodity, right? So right, the idea that like SSO, the one thing I would say is that I can see having a setup fee or something along those lines. If there is some additional work to get it set up and running, then having a fee for that makes total sense. But to have
I see it for like non-social providers, right? Like if you're trying to connect to my Active Directory federated services or whatever that I run on-prem or I run in Azure Cloud or whatever, I get it. Like that's not the most common setup. And I'm sure there's a lot of troubleshooting with like whitelisting IP addresses and that type of stuff. But for like the vast majority of people that just want to sign in with Google,
right?
Like I don't get it because Google's already made all the stuff. They put it out for free. It's kind of here.
So the nice thing is there's different tiers, right? So there's plenty of companies. So Slack, I'll throw under the bus a little bit. So Slack charges more for SSO. That's an enterprise thing, and that's you have to go up to the I think $6 or $12 per user level, whatever it is. It's a significant increase per user. It's double per month per user to get access to the SSO. But at least at the beginning tier of paid user, they offer sign in with Google. They allow for the social. But the idea that that there's some sort of additional cost per user per period of time is just mind-boggling to me. And companies that do that, it really does.
Do you think it's like an engineering decision or like straight sales? Just like how do we
sales? The opportunity is there, right? How do we differentiate? How do we differentiate the enterprise package from the business package?
That's all.
SSO.
Yeah. It's so there's economics. There's like this concept of surplus, right? Where there's a reserve price at which I'll provide you a product, but I'm basically breaking even. And then there's like what you're willing to pay for it before you're like, forget it. If there's a delta in between there, it's called surplus. And sales is all about who gets that surplus, right? So if you're willing to sell me something for $2, I'm willing to pay 10. What's the price that gets paid? And so here's the challenge, right? Is that so from a company perspective, we have some cost of goods sold, right? Say it's $2. Well, if there's a pool of customers that all have different reserve prices, I'm leaving money on the table if I price at a single level, right? And so if I have Starbucks is like great at this, for example, like you could buy.
Wait, how much does SSO cost at Starbucks?
You can basically go there and pay $1.50 for a cup of coffee or $6 for a whatever. It's basically an identical product. Like, let's be real. There's like, you put sprinkles and swirls and whatever in it, but it's basically the same. So if you're a price blind, like caffeine fiending customer and you're cool with paying $5 for a cup of coffee, they have a way for you to do that. And so all this pricing differentiation is just a way for companies to grab as much surplus as possible. My guess here is, to your point, G, SSO is one of the easiest ways to differentiate enterprises, which are typically willing to pay a lot more for SaaS than from someone who's a non-enterprise.
Well, and the other thing, the SSO and like SCIM, I think those two things go together. I don't know if everybody's familiar with SCIM, but it's the provisioning, automatic deep provisioning and provisioning of accounts based on the SSO and the IDP and stuff. I think that when you're smaller and you have less people to manage, you're sort of like, we don't really need the SSO. I can add and remove people. I can set up the permissioning properly. And I can remember when we terminate this person that I have to go through these 15 other systems and term them as well. And you have like an offboarding checklist as opposed to full automation. But I think that's changing. I look at Cybrary, even as when we were only 20 people, 90% of what we were doing for onboarding and offboarding was all through automation. And so I do think to your point, so as you get larger, right, in enterprise, they're definitely going to be willing to pay a lot more for the ability to automate things as opposed to having to have a large IT staff so that they can do onboarding and offboarding checklists.
Yeah, but when, like, at what point do we say as the industry that like security is just like standard, right? Like multi-factor is
but
now
that's not
standard.
it's not the security industry that gets to set that. It's the buyers. It's the people, right? If the consumer, right.
To be super clear, like I'm not advocating that this is like it's just prescriptive. Like we're just being prescriptive about like this is how enterprises sell, because what do businesses do? They maximize profit, right? So I think it's bullshit. I think it's terrible that we sell security because everyone has a right to security, I think.
Right. I mean, I have no problem with selling it if it costs more, if there's an actual difference. But like for us, like the way our platform is designed, aside from the work that we have to do to get SSO configured and set up, there's the troubleshooting, there's, exchanges of information. It actually involves, we haven't fully automated it so that just anybody can go in and put in, the configuration. It makes sense that that has a cost associated with it. But after that, it's pretty flat. Now, I could imagine a universe, and I've been in these conversations where we start talking about, well, what's the differentiation between this package and this package, where SSO, maybe people would pay more for SSO. And as somebody in the room saying, like, I really don't want to be that company. I know that there's this, like, there is, I can't remember the name of the website, but there is a wall of shame of companies that charge more for SSO. And I just really don't want to see Cybrary on that list. But there's also the business side, and you can't always win. Totally. So I don't think it's completely on the security people. I think there's also a fair bit of on the consumer. I know when I'm negotiating deals, if they're trying to charge more for SSO, I always say, like, is there any, like, what can we do? Can you guys? I don't need the enterprise package. 80% of what's in the enterprise package just doesn't apply to us. But SSO is something I really want. Can you check whatever box?
Right. And I think it's like this weird never ending game, right? Because if you think about like a lot of like the vendor assessments and things like that, when companies are trying to bring in Cybrary, we have to answer questions all the time of like, are your services using multi-factor? Are you using single sign-on?
Right. Are you using single sign-on everywhere where it's available? And it's like, well, yeah, we are for the price point.
Right. That we're at. But like, that's a difficult, and so it's like this self-feeding thing. But I wonder, like, at what point do you think we can kind of force it to become like, right? Because I would argue that multi-factor is pretty much common these days. Like it's based, I would hope, like baseline. Like, are we getting to the point where single sign-on and that type of stuff is almost to that point where we're kind of just like security is becoming way more in the front of everybody's mind, and it's becoming that first question that we ask. And so I'm hoping that like we're getting there faster than it took for like multi-factor to take off.
I think the difference between something like SSO and multi-factor, I could be wrong, is that from my perspective, the cost is the same. Like from an engineering, there's libraries, there's things, there's partners that we can work with that can help us to provide this and make it very, very easy for us to set up the SSO. It actually removes a certain amount of risk. We're now shifting that. So I think that there's a point at which you get to where it's just so commodity, and it's actually easier. It's that point where it's like, it's just easier to do SSO than it is username and password. And I think, Jonathan, you and I have even talked about, like, as we roll out more and more social login for Cybrary, like, when do we get to the point where we're not even asking people for usernames and passwords, and like 90% of our users are signing in through Facebook, through LinkedIn, through Google, Apple, whatever it may be, or
going Magic Link.
Right. And then replacing it eventually, once we get to that 10%, like, how can we just do Magic Link rather than having any credentials stored on our system? So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other really interesting pressures is I look at, to make this confusing, SSL, not SSO, as different, but another example of where the security industry was able to make certs basically free, through Let's Encrypt. I mean, for a long time, free, modulo like your time and getting it working. But for a long time, companies would just print, it's still to some extent, just print money by like issuing these SSLs. I mean, extended validation requires, I guess, a little bit of elbow grease, but like your vanilla SSL cert doesn't cost you anything. So you can
Right.
automate the whole process. And so,
Right.
But by releasing this tool, the EFF, we keep talking about them because they're great, but they released this tool, and all of a sudden security becomes free, and it just becomes table stakes that that providers give certificates.
Although it's funny that you bring that up, because there's a couple of vendors with whom we work who, they are going to have a Cybrary subdomain. So they're sort of want to manage our certs for us, and they then want to charge us thousands of dollars for a cert.
Wow, that's insane.
Yeah, it's
Still
insane.
happens.
It's like, right. It's like, I don't understand. We can just send you one. No, we have to use ours, and it's going to cost us $5,000 to get it for you.
Yeah, there was, what was this last year? We're looking at like marketing software and things like that. And if you want, how like marketing software has like landing pages that they get you to go to, and you had to pay them if you wanted an SSL, like an HTTPS landing page, you had to pay them the money for the certs.
Yeah, it makes me sad.
Right. Actually, we had two options. We had two options, right? We could either pay them the money for the cert, or we could pay some amount of money for the customization to use our own cert. And it was 6 of one, half dozen of the other in terms of price. It was the exact same cost. So we were like, well, I guess we'll be paying for the cert rather than the hassle, because this company, whatever.
And then once we paid for it, they put the wrong cert on our website right off the bat. And so,
that's all.
Yeah. Anyway,
it makes me upset.
Yeah,
it's very difficult, especially because everything we kind of run now is like all Let's Encrypt automated stuff. And so when it's trying to talk to vendors, I would say marketing software is kind of like behind the curve is where I generally see a lot of these issues. And I guess possibly some sales software, but like Salesforce has kind of eliminated that because they got smart to the whole, let's just automate this and then we don't have to worry about it. But marketing software seems to be kind of lagging behind the curve and thinking they can still get away with it, which I think a lot of it has to do with the audience you're selling to.
Right? Oh, exactly right. Who's the buyer in that? I think for a lot of cases, I think that when I was talking to the various marketing vendors that we talked to, I think that they were not expecting the CISO to be involved in the initial conversations. It's sort of like, they'd be going through and like, oh, so what's your security? What do we have to do to get through the security process? Like, no, actually, we're doing that throughout the entire this conversation. Right. It's not just this like, oh, send us some documentation at the end and we check some boxes.
And then sometimes still some things slip through the crack when you sign up with a vendor and realize they don't support basic email security.
I was waiting for that one.
Right? Like DMARC. They just don't support DMARC. And DMARC's been around for what, like 8 years now, I think. And so it's just, I don't understand how you're still selling software. And then it's like, you talk to them and they're like, it's not on our roadmap.
Oh, I thought they said it was on the roadmap. It's just not. It's always 9 months out. That's that as a former head of product, I can tell you what you say is it's about 9 months to a year.
9 months is an eternity. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. That means it's never getting done. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like your job is to send emails. How do you not support basic email sending?
I feel like the correction has to be customers getting smart to these issues and being choosy, using it as a factor in their consideration, right? I mean, if you believe in market dynamics, that's got to be it. So part of it is the security industry educating consumers about why this is bad, I guess.
Actually, I'm just going to start lobbying Congress to pass a law that says you can't charge more for SSO. I think that's really how the United States works.
Problem solved.
Well, the government will get an SSO account on all systems that they.
There you go. I think this goes back to Bob at the FBI.
Yeah.
That's how they get the back door.
Win.
Win, exactly.
I do think one thing that I'm hoping as a community, security people and like CISOs, we can come together and stop paying for like administrator accounts to like all of the softwares.
I will say, I will say the couple of vendors I've talked to recently have been great in terms of, so typically the sort of super admin privileges sort of go with this like owner, and they have full permission to do everything on the platform. And they don't really have a notion of like, oh, this is just an administrative user that should be able to like manage the people, but not necessarily the actual functionality of the platform. Right. And I've been very happy with at least the vendors we've talked to where I'm like, hey, I need 3 seats for administrative accounts. We're never going to log in to the system to do the actual thing this thing is meant to do, but I need access in order to provision and deprovision because you're going to charge me more for SSO. And skim. So, and they've been very good at least throwing in a couple extra user licenses for administrative accounts. But even there, I feel like the fact that I have to ask or that you didn't even think like, oh, there should just be an admin only type role.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just going to say that actually concerns me because it totally violates the principle of least privilege. Like you should be
which
using,
principle?
Yeah. Because like you should be using your like daily account to be doing all kinds of stuff. And then it also has God mode on your whole platform.
Yeah, and then we recently had a vendor.
Yeah.
We had a vendor recently charge us more for admin seats.
Oh yeah, the admin seats are more, even though they have less functionality. Like the functionality they have is not. Yeah.
Price differentiation.
Surplus. Yeah. Well, you need an admin. You're going to need admin accounts.
Right. Right.
Yeah, might as well. We know you need them. Yeah. Like you need them to set up. So.
Right.
Especially because I think as security gets more and more baked into a lot of products, like you need the security person to be able to go in and like check audit logs and like validate these things that they're selling to you, and to connect single sign-on and to connect social auth and to like enforce certain data restrictions and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that would be a nice shift to see like dedicated roles, I guess, start to emerge out of the traditional like administrator. Is kind of like see it start to shift to have like a security type role and then maybe like a user administrator type thing that you can kind of differentiate. But like you can't even follow principal least privilege because you only have 6 seats. And so it's like, oh, well, Jim from accounting is going to get master administrator every time he logs in because I don't have enough seats.
Yep.
And so
it's so interesting. It makes me wonder whether like this move to SaaS has actually created perverse incentives for security people, right? Like because we've moved to SaaS and there's like this cost per user per month or whatever, are we creating scenarios where like it's just expensive for security? I don't know because I wasn't around in the pre-SaaS era really. So
you're asking me to talk to this.
Gee, please hold court.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think that there's a couple different things, right? When, before SaaS and everything was like sort of on-prem deployment and you still were paying per user, per license, per whatever, it was from a company perspective. Like I remember selling into those, it's just a nightmare to do the license management. And then how do you make sure that the company's not actually violating the license and all of the code that has to go into like enforcing licenses because it's in a hostile environment, and how do you go back and check with the mothership and have a signed, shipping over like a config file that has a signature on it that says 15 licenses. And then it's like, well, it's Java code. They can actually there's a way, like there's all these things
they have
to do.
Right, they have physical access.
Right. And they can decompile the code and they can recompile it with, and do things. So that was a nightmare. So the move to SaaS, at least from the application development perspective, has reduced the cost of security, right? Because now it's all server side, and it solves that. It should be all server side. So it solves some of that. In terms of
but your attack vectors are like infinitely larger than they used to be, right? Because from an application security's perspective, you would deploy into a customer's data center, and you would have the assumption, hopefully, that the customer was securing everything coming into that data center and hopefully to that rack, right? So you didn't have to worry about that. You were like, I'm assuming only good, like you could, right? You could assume only good traffic was getting to my software.
To a certain extent, but you still had to deal with the fact that there might be malicious insiders, that what happens if it gets hacked, what's the liability? But yes, definitely.
But now you have a public website that anybody with the Burp Suite can just run, or the low ion whatever cannon, and just hit your site.
So let me be really clear here, right? Where we shifted is from license management and whether or not users are violating licenses, which isn't security, that's license management, to now we have security concerns. So from a software engineering perspective, it doesn't, I mean, software engineers, we've shifted because of cloud and because of all of these tools and DevSecOps and other things that we have. And because we are building on the shoulders of giants, right? We don't have to build every single thing. I think using SaaS within the platform for solving these things, I think has reduced the amount of time or effort the software engineer has to put into things. I'm not suggesting that the security footprint's any smaller or that the costs for securing things are smaller, but certainly the engineering cost or the amount of engineering time spent on these problems has diminished. And you can have engineers focused on building features and functions that differentiate you as opposed to building bullshit like login, forgot password, authentication crap that like they're inevitably going to get wrong because that's just how things go. So anyway, let me get back on that or get off this horse. So where were we?
Yeah, we were talking about how it's like the essentially the copywriting, the license management
right.
is easier. And, you know, I think we were going to talk about from the customer's perspective. Like
right. Right. So one of the perverse, right. Thank you for reminding me. So because now when you have a per license cost, right now there's this perverse incentive for like, hey, this is really expensive. Why don't we buy 5 seats and share these seats, and we'll use a password manager, or maybe we won't. Maybe we'll use an Excel spreadsheet. Shame on you. Whatever you're going to use,
or password 1 2 3.
Right.
Easy, easy.
Or we all know what the password is, right? We all know it's the name of the company followed by some other thing, followed by whatever, some pattern. But yeah, so there's an incentive to create shared accounts because the cost of having an administrator in addition to the user is so high. And so, and then you lose auditing, you lose so much on that trade-off of who did what.
And that shared user is probably the system admin. So they have just God mode when they log in to change whatever, and there's no way to figure anything out.
Right.
Although I guess that incentive existed when it was on-prem too.
Oh, it absolutely did. That incentive absolutely did, right? Yeah.
Maybe not like super long ago, because like the admin could just log SSH into the box and change the config file. Right. Like everything's in a UI type situation. And the sysadmins and the DB admins didn't have to have licenses to the software. They could still go in, perform maintenance, do upgrades, right? Like it wasn't like they needed to log in to see anything. They would just connect to the database to steal all the data.
Or connect to the database to change configuration settings. I seem to recall those days.
Why do we still have DNS, man?
Oh, did you see the new Apple iOS 14 is going to turn that on by default? The DNS over
HTTP or DNSSEC? Which one?
DNS over HTTPS.
Yeah,
I think is now an option, and you can push it to computers in the Mac OS. The new one, 11. The DEP and all that management stuff. Like we can force all our computers to use DNS over HTTPS, and then I guess this is an interesting take. The whole when on the new iOS 14, when your device joins a Wi-Fi network, it can present an anonymized MAC address. So that you can't do fingerprinting. And so every time it joins, it does another random
That's cool.
MAC address, which is pretty interesting. But I wonder how that starts to work and play with kind of like the enterprise and things like that. Where
you can't do port level security.
Right. Well, I mean, you didn't really have port level security on Wi-Fi, but
that's fair.
I mean, I guess everybody's using Radius anyway. And so as long as you're authenticating a certain way, but I don't know if that's more secure or less secure. I think it's an interesting idea. I think there's got to be Apple's smarter than probably all of us, but like
totally. Oh, without doubt.
But they also err on the side of privacy, right? So the fact that your company can't necessarily as easily monitor everything that you're doing, that's more there.
Right. But I'm trying to think on like the whole Apple, like design wise, like if you're doing stuff in your home network, right? Like we're kind of getting to that point where you get notifications when a new device joins your Wi-Fi and things like that. But if it's always this random ID, does that kind of kill some of that security in favor of privacy?
I mean, you were always, as an attacker, able to spoof existing MAC addresses, but it does add complexity to the attack.
Does it add complexity?
Yeah, because you have collisions potentially.
And it makes it more difficult, I guess.
You already have collisions. You already have collisions with IoT because some of those manufacturers just use the same stupid MAC address for every light bulb on the network. Same MAC address.
Just put it on a different. You put it on a different collision domain. It's fine. One router per device.
Anyway. One router per light bulb. I'm trying to remember if you were on that podcast with where Joe and I talked about that. I'm on the 401 access denied. If that was. We definitely talked about the MAC address and IoT.
Yeah. I just use Unify and put all the IoT crap on its own network. Wild West, man.
Which is not easy to set up.
No, it's not. It's
Unify's VLAN stuff is.
Yeah, I had. I'm a big fan of the.
I have different physical routers. That's the easiest way.
That's a good way to do it. It's a good way to do it.
It's just cheap. Well, easy. Because I don't have anything.
Sounds expensive.
Well, no, because I don't have anything better to do with the Verizon router that they give me with my with my FiOS. So I might as well use that for IoT and things I'm less care about, and then have my real network behind that. So.
But then what if that device gets owned because you put it on the less secure network?
But it's still on the outside of
in your house.
No, I don't. Okay, let's be serious about what IoT I have in my house.
Okay, sorry, generic IoT. But.
I'm an old dude who wears a tinfoil hat. There's no cameras that are.
But you use the Verizon provided router.
Only for and then I have a router that sits behind that with a firewall, so it treats it just like the regular public. All the cameras in my house are closed. Was it CCTV? The old school with cables. Nobody.
Yeah.
All right.
I know what you're talking about, man.
Yeah, it sounds miserable to manage, but I'm sure once you got it set up, it was just rock solid.
It was a joke. We don't have cameras in my house.
Oh, I was about to say you're probably recording like VHS or Betamax too.
Oh, Beta. We're definitely recording.
Totally, it's a superior technology.
Yeah.
Well, it's also super secure because nobody. It's better than encryption. Nobody has the player.
It's just like security through obscurity is definitely a form of security. Like there's no doubt about it. It's just you shouldn't rely on it.
Right.